Section 1. The spectrum of cessation and the discipline of preservation. Stopping is not a singular act. It exists on a spectrum, and understanding that spectrum is the difference between preservation and collapse. At one extreme lies exhaustion, the point where continuation is no longer physically, cognitively, or structurally possible. At the other lies collapse, motion that continues despite the loss of meaning, where outputs persist, but no longer correspond to the invariant they once served. Between these extremes exists a critical middle ground, one that most systems pass through without naming and therefore without controlling. This middle ground is where systems either learn to stop or quietly begin to fail. Pause as tactical stillness. The most benign form of stopping is the pause. A pause is not an admission of failure, nor a declaration of structural insufficiency. It is a tactical breath taken by the system itself. A pause assumes that preservation remains possible under the existing invariants, but that local conditions, attention, scope, synchronization, or verification have degraded. By halting temporarily, the system creates space to restore those local conditions without demanding redesign or extension. Pauses are reversible by intent. They do not challenge the invariant. They protect it by reducing pressure. They are not defensive gestures against existential threat, but deliberate recalibrations of pace. Crucially, a pause differs from collapse in that it is chosen. It is articulated. It is framed as a means of preservation rather than a consequence of failure. A system that pauses says, in effect, we can still do this correctly, but not like this, not right now, and not without resetting our footing. Where pauses are normalized, they prevent drift. Where they are stigmatized or ignored, drift becomes inevitable. Drift as unnamed failure. Drift is not the absence of stopping. It is stopping without acknowledgement. In drift, a system continues to move, while its enforcement of invariance weakens incrementally. No single step appears catastrophic. Outputs still resemble success. Processes still produce artifacts. Meetings still conclude with action items. But the coupling between action and invariant is no longer enforced structurally. Instead, meaning is preserved narratively. Checks that once verified correctness now require explanation. Deviations are justified rather than blocked. Validation shifts from being a gate before motion to a story told after the fact. The system has not stopped, but it has already ceased to preserve. Drift is often misnamed as flexibility or pragmatism. In reality, it is collapse unfolding at a speed slow enough to avoid alarm. By the time outcomes are visibly wrong, the mechanisms that once allowed correction have already eroded. Local checks as commitment devices. The antidote to drift is not vigilance or heroism. It is structure, specifically the local check. A local check is not merely a procedural step. It is a commitment device that binds the system to its invariant at the smallest enforceable scale. It is where truth is either verified or motion is denied. When a local check can no longer be completed without narrative justification, when it requires explanation, discretion, or retrospective approval, the system has already crossed a boundary. It is no longer enforcing preservation. It is negotiating it. Effort cannot substitute for structure. Asking individuals to be careful or use judgment in the absence of enforceable checks does not strengthen a system. It transfers the burden of coherence onto people, turning human attention into a fragile, exhaustible buffer. The coherence tax. As drift advances, systems incur a coherence tax, the rising cost of maintaining the appearance of meaning. This tax is paid in meetings about alignment, documents that explain why plans were missed, dashboards that contextualize declining performance, and narratives that reinterpret outcomes to preserve plausibility. None of this work restores the invariant. It merely conceals its absence. A healthy, halted system can tell a short, consistent story about itself. It can state what it preserves, why it stopped, and what must change before continuation resumes. A system in collapse cannot do this. Its story requires constant revision. Goals shift quietly. Failures are rebranded. History becomes unstable. Metrics, cascades, and anchors. When metrics decouple from invariance, indicator cascades form. New metrics are introduced to explain old ones. Layers accumulate. Visibility replaces verification. The escape is an invariant anchor, a small, enforceable rule that restores local truth. Anchors are powerful because they are non-negotiable, not because they are comprehensive. Stop roles and bridge rules. Systems that preserve meaning embed. Stop roles. Explicit authority to halt motion when invariants fail. These roles derive power from necessity, not hierarchy. A halt must also define a bridge rule, a temporary invariant that permits limited motion while repair occurs. Without a bridge, halts stagnate. Without halts, bridges drift. Bounded progress and stillness. Progress is a bounded vector, not an unbounded line. It has direction, magnitude, and limits. Halting restores boundedness. Stillness, chosen deliberately, is not failure. It is signal. It shows that meaning is still being defended. A system that can refuse to continue is a system that can be trusted. Section 2. Coherence Debt, Structural Ethics, and the Practice of Stopping. Systems do not fail all at once. Long before collapse becomes visible, a quieter transfer takes place. The work of preservation migrates out of structure and into people. This transfer is rarely explicit. It presents itself as dedication, flexibility, or professionalism. In reality, it is the accumulation of coherence debt. Coherence debt is incurred when a system continues operating without the structural means to enforce its own invariance. The missing enforcement does not disappear. It is absorbed. Individuals reconcile contradictions manually, remember exceptions, anticipate failures, and improvise safeguards. They become the connective tissue holding incompatible parts together. This is not resilience, it is depletion, the human buffer. When preservation is not designed into a system, humans become buffers of incoherence. They smooth over mismatches between policy and reality, intent and execution, promise and outcome. Over time, the system comes to rely on this buffering. Heroics become normalized. Burnout becomes invisible infrastructure. The danger of human buffering is not only ethical, it is epistemic. Because the system appears to function, the absence of structure goes unnoticed. Success is attributed to effort rather than subsidy. Failures, when they occur, are blamed on individuals rather than on the conditions that required heroics in the first place. A system that relies on human buffering cannot accurately observe itself. It mistakes sacrifice for stability. The ethical shift, from compensation to clarification. Structural ethics begins with a refusal to compensate silently. Instead of asking people to absorb incoherence, ethical systems work to clarify boundaries, checks, and stopping points. This does not eliminate the need for judgment. It repositions judgment where it belongs, inside preserved structure, not as a substitute for it. Expertise is used to improve systems, not to hold broken ones together indefinitely. The ethical question is therefore not whether people can cope, but whether they should have to. Stopping as a practiced discipline. Because stopping is culturally stigmatized, many systems only halt under crisis conditions. By then, stopping is experienced as failure, blame, or loss of control. To counter this, stopping must be practiced. Practiced stopping transforms halting from an emergency response into a routine skill. Low-stakes halts, pausing meetings, simulating deployment stops, interrupting reviews to restate criteria, build shared muscle memory. They normalize stillness as part of competent motion. When stopping is practiced, it becomes faster, calmer, and more precise. It sheds drama and acquires clarity. The three-sentence halt with time. A halt that preserves meaning can be communicated succinctly. What we preserve, where it breaks, how we will extend, when we will re-evaluate. The temporal boundary is essential. It prevents halts from becoming indefinite freezes and converts them into scheduled checkpoints. Time-boxed stopping is active, not passive. A halt without time is paralysis. Time without halt is drift. Stillness as structural signal. In mature systems, stillness is not absence of action. It is a signal emitted deliberately at the moment motion would degrade meaning. This signal communicates internally and externally that preservation takes precedence over throughput. It reassures participants that integrity is being actively defended. It restores trust, not by promising success, but by demonstrating restraint. The capacity to stop cleanly is therefore a marker of intelligence. It indicates a system capable of self-observation, self-limitation, and self-respect. Bounded progress. Revisited. Progress only exists within bounds. Direction without limit is chaos. Velocity without constraint is erosion. Stopping is what makes bounds visible again. It reveals where preservation still holds and where extension is required. Without stopping, systems cannot distinguish between movement and advancement. The disciplined system is not the one that moves fastest, but the one that knows precisely when not to move. Closing note. A system that refuses to continue under incoherence is not fragile. It is trustworthy. Its refusal is not obstruction, but care. Its stillness is not emptiness, but attention. In choosing when to stop, the system preserves the conditions under which starting again can mean something. Section 3. Failure modes, recovery paths, and structural repair. Systems rarely fail because they lack intelligence or effort. They fail because they continue operating after the conditions that once guaranteed meaning have quietly disappeared. Understanding failure, therefore, is not about cataloging errors. It is about recognizing recognizable patterns where preservation breaks down and how recovery becomes possible again. Failure modes as structural patterns. Most systemic failures fall into a small number of repeatable forms. These are not moral failings or individual mistakes. They are structural configurations that make collapse likely. One common failure mode is silent override. Formal rules remain written, but informal exceptions accumulate. Each exception appears reasonable in isolation. Over time, the invariant becomes optional in practice while remaining mandatory in language. Another failure mode is escalation without anchoring. When local checks fail, responsibility is pushed upward instead of being resolved structurally. Decisions move farther from the point of truth, increasing delay and reducing fidelity. A third failure mode is metric substitution. Measurement continues, but metrics shift from representing invariance to representing effort, activity, or explanation. Performance appears legible even as preservation vanishes. These modes share a trait. Motion continues while meaning erodes. Early warning signals. Because collapse unfolds gradually, early signals matter. Systems that learn to observe themselves can intervene before failure hardens. Rising coherence tax is one such signal. When more time is spent explaining outcomes than producing preserved results, structure is already weakening. Another signal is narrative inflation. When success requires increasingly elaborate stories, slide decks, or reframing language, verification has likely been replaced by persuasion. A third signal is moral fatigue. When individuals report exhaustion without a corresponding increase in meaningful output, they are likely buffering incoherence. None of these signals require blame. They require stopping. Recovery as rebinding. Recovery is not reversal, it is rebinding. To recover, a system must reattach action to invariant at a local point. This almost never happens at the scale of vision statements or reorganizations. It happens through small, enforceable repairs. Recovery begins by reinstating a local check that cannot be bypassed narratively. This check creates a new point of truth. From there, bridge rules regulate motion while missing structure is rebuilt. Importantly, recovery often feels like slowing down. Velocity drops. Output temporarily decreases. This is not regression. It is the visible cost of restoring meaning. Structural repair over cultural fixes. Many organizations attempt to repair failure culturally. Workshops, values statements, renewed commitments. These efforts are not useless, but they are insufficient on their own. Culture follows structure. When preservation mechanisms are absent, no amount of shared intention can prevent drift. When checks, anchors, and stop roles are restored, culture often realigns without explicit intervention. Structural repair therefore prioritizes clarity over motivation, boundaries over exhortation, and enforceability over aspiration. Designing for the next halt. A repaired system should not aim to eliminate stopping. It should aim to stop earlier next time. Each halt reveals where structure was insufficient. Ethical systems treat halts as diagnostic data, not embarrassment. They record where checks failed, where authority was unclear, and where human buffering absorbed too much load. Design then proceeds from these observations. The goal is not robustness through rigidity, but resilience through intelligible limits. From failure to trust. Trust is not built by uninterrupted motion. It is built by predictable preservation. A system that halts when invariants fail, repairs transparently, and resumes under clear conditions becomes legible to those who depend on it. Its refusals become as meaningful as its outputs. In this way, failure, when met with disciplined stopping, becomes a source of strength rather than stigma. Closing reflection. The most dangerous systems are not those that fail visibly, but those that never quite stop. They move endlessly, producing artifacts, metrics, and explanations while meaning quietly drains away. The disciplined system interrupts this trajectory. It stops. It names what matters. It rebuilds locally. And only then does it move again, slowly, boundedly, and with renewed integrity. Section 4. Field patterns of stopping across domains. Stopping is not domain-specific. The same structural patterns appear wherever systems attempt to preserve meaning under pressure. What changes across domains is vocabulary, scale, and tempo, not the underlying mechanics. By examining cross-domain field patterns, we can recognize stopping not as a specialized technique, but as a general discipline. Software systems. Verification before velocity. In software, drift most often begins with speed. Deadlines compress, features stack, and local checks are treated as obstacles rather than safeguards. Tests are deferred, reviews shortened, and exceptions normalized. The field pattern here is clear. When verification lags behind change, narrative fills the gap. Bugs are explained instead of prevented. Stability is promised rather than enforced. Effective recovery in software almost always begins with a single invariant anchor. No change without verification. This may take the form of mandatory tests, enforced build gates, or immutable deployment rules. Once reinstated, velocity initially drops, but coherence returns. The most mature software teams treat stopping as routine. Failed builds halt pipelines automatically. Rollbacks are executed without debate. The absence of drama is the signal of health. Healthcare, dual verification, and the refusal to proceed. In healthcare, stopping carries obvious moral weight, yet the structural logic is identical. Drift occurs when workload, staffing pressure, or urgency erodes local verification. Informal knowledge substitutes for checks. Familiarity replaces confirmation. Errors become more likely precisely because nothing appears unusual. The field pattern of preservation is dual verification at the point of action. Wristbands, barcodes, checklists, and timeouts are not bureaucratic overhead. They are invariant anchors. When these anchors fail, ethical systems authorize refusal. A nurse, technician, or physician must be structurally empowered to stop a procedure without negotiation. Without this authority, preservation becomes dependent on courage rather than design. A healthcare system that cannot stop cleanly forces individuals into moral risk. One that can stop routinely distributes responsibility safely. Education. Assessment as local truth. In education, drift manifests as grade inflation, curriculum mismatch, and symbolic completion. Students progress while mastery quietly decouples from advancement. The preservation invariant in education is not content coverage, but learning integrity. Local checks take the form of assessments that genuinely test understanding rather than compliance. When assessment becomes narrative, participation grades, completion credit, or discretionary pass-through, meaning erodes. Recovery begins by re-establishing assessment as a local truth device, even if it temporarily slows progression. Ethical educational systems stop cohorts when failure rates spike, not to punish, but to diagnose. Tutoring, alternative instruction, and revised pacing act as bridge rules while structure is repaired. Manufacturing, defects, and the authority to halt. Manufacturing offers one of the clearest illustrations of stopping as intelligence. Here, the invariant is physical: tolerances, defect rates, and safety limits. Drift appears when inspection is reduced, sampling widened, or thresholds quietly relaxed. The field pattern of recovery is uncompromising. Halt the line. Stopping production is costly. That cost is precisely why it preserves meaning. Continuing to produce known defects transfers cost downstream, where it multiplies. The authority to stop the line, regardless of output pressure, is a hallmark of ethical manufacturing systems. Where this authority is symbolic or discouraged, defects become normalized, and trust erodes. Finance and governance. Authorization as structural check. In financial systems, drift often takes the form of exception creep. Limits exist, but approvals become rubber stamps. Oversight shifts from prevention to explanation. The invariant anchor here is dual authorization with traceability. Large transactions require independent verification not because individuals are untrustworthy, but because structure must be. Stopping in finance is frequently automated. Trades halted, accounts frozen, audits triggered. These halts are not accusations. They are preservation signals. Systems that treat halts as failures invite concealment. Systems that treat them as routine preserve legitimacy. Common failure patterns across domains. Across all domains, three failure patterns recur. First, narrative substitution. Explanation replaces verification. Second, authority diffusion. No one is clearly empowered to stop. Third, human buffering. Individuals absorb incoherence silently. Recovery reverses these patterns structurally, not rhetorically. Stopping as a portable skill. Because the mechanics of stopping recur across contexts, stopping itself becomes a transferable skill. People trained in one domain to recognize drift, name invariants, and halt cleanly can apply the same discipline elsewhere. This portability is a sign that stopping is not cultural preference, but structural literacy. Closing synthesis. Across domains, the lesson is consistent. Systems that preserve meaning do so by stopping early, locally, and without drama. They do not rely on heroics. They do not confuse motion with progress. They treat stillness as information. Where stopping is practiced, trust accumulates. Where it is avoided, collapse becomes inevitable, just slowly enough to be mistaken for success. Section 5. The Stop Canon, a unified framework for structural preservation. Across domains, scales, and technologies, the same truth recurs. Systems fail not because they move, but because they move without the ability to refuse motion. What has been described so far, pause, drift, local checks, coherence debt, stop rolls, bridge rules, can now be unified into a single, portable framework. This framework is not prescriptive in content, but structural in form. It is the Stop Canon. The canon is a small set of principles that any system can apply, regardless of purpose, to preserve meaning under pressure. Principle 1. Name the invariant. Every system exists to preserve something. That something must be stated plainly, publicly, and operationally. If the invariant cannot be named in one sentence, it cannot be defended. Vague aspirations do not halt motion, only enforceable claims do. Naming the invariant is a speech act. It converts intuition into structure and creates a shared reference point that legitimizes stopping. Principle 2. Bind the invariant locally. An invariant that cannot be enforced locally will erode globally. Local checks are the binding sites of preservation. They must be simple, non-negotiable, and executable without narrative justification. When a local check fails, motion must stop automatically or by clear authority. If local enforcement requires persuasion, the system is already drifting. Principle 3. Authorize refusal. Stopping must be authorized in advance. Every preserved system embeds explicit stop roles, functions empowered and obligated to halt motion when invariants fail. These roles exist to protect meaning against momentum, hierarchy, and urgency. Without authorized refusal, stopping becomes personal risk rather than structural duty. Principle 4. Define the bridge. Stopping without a path forward invites paralysis. Moving without preservation invites collapse. Bridge rules define the conditions under which limited motion may continue while structure is repaired. They are temporary, stricter invariants that govern transition. A bridge rule answers a single question: how may we proceed without pretending nothing broke? Principle 5. Time. Bound the halt. A halt without time dissolves into stagnation. Time without halting dissolves into drift. Every halt must include a temporal boundary, a scheduled moment of reassessment. This converts stopping from an emotional event into an operational checkpoint. Time-bounded halts are active maintenance, not surrender. Principle 6. Treat halts as data. Each halt reveals where structure was insufficient. Healthy systems record halts, analyze their causes, and redesign accordingly. Halts are not failures to be hidden, but signals to be studied. The goal is not to stop less often, but to stop earlier, more cheaply, and more clearly. Principle 7. Never externalize coherence debt. When systems lack structure, people absorb the cost. This is exploitation, not resilience. Ethical systems refuse to externalize coherence debt onto individuals. They relocate preservation into process, tooling, and authority. Human judgment is reserved for improvement and escalation, not perpetual compensation. Principle 8. Preserve bounded progress. Progress only exists within limits. Stopping maintains the bounds that make progress intelligible. Systems that cannot stop cannot distinguish advancement from erosion. Bounded progress is not slower progress. It is the only kind that accumulates meaning over time. The canon as diagnostic tool. The stop canon is not only a design guide, it is a diagnostic. When a system struggles, one can ask, is the invariant named? Is it locally enforced? Is refusal authorized? Is a bridge defined? Is the halt time-bound? Are halts treated as data? Is coherence debt externalized? Are bounds respected? A single missing element is enough to permit drift. The canon as discipline. Like any discipline, stopping must be practiced. The canon is not a checklist to be completed once, but a framework to be revisited continually as systems evolve. What matters is not perfection, but fidelity, the ongoing alignment between motion and meaning. Closing reflection. A system that can articulate why it stops, how it repairs, and when it resumes demonstrates maturity. The stop canon does not promise uninterrupted success. It promises something rarer and more valuable, the preservation of truth over time. In a world optimized for speed, the ability to refuse motion becomes the highest form of intelligence. Conclusion. Trust, refusal, and the discipline of meaning. Trust is not built by uninterrupted motion. It is built by the visible defense of meaning. A system earns trust when it demonstrates that it will not continue at any cost, under any condition, or in any direction. Trust emerges when participants, users, workers, dependents, can see that preservation outranks throughput, and that refusal is not an accident, but a practiced capability. Refusal as a positive act. In many cultures, refusal is framed as obstruction, negativity, or weakness. Within preserved systems, the opposite is true. Refusal is an affirmative act. It asserts that something matters enough to protect. It draws a boundary around meaning and declares that crossing it would constitute loss rather than progress. A system that never refuses reveals that nothing within it is truly defended. The quiet signal of integrity. Stopping does not need to be loud to be effective. The most mature systems halt quietly. A pipeline stops. A line pauses. A meeting adjourns early. The absence of drama is not indifference. It is competence. Everyone involved understands why motion ceased and what must occur before it resumes. This quietness is a signal of integrity. It indicates that preservation is embedded deeply enough that it no longer requires justification. Trust accumulates in these moments of unremarkable stillness, from heroics to stewardship. Where stopping is absent, heroics emerge. Individuals compensate for missing structure with effort, attention, and sacrifice. Over time, this erodes both people and systems. Where stopping is practiced, stewardship replaces heroics. responsibility is distributed structurally. Individuals are no longer asked to choose between correctness and survival. This shift is not only ethical, it is stabilizing. Systems designed for stewardship outlast those that depend on sacrifice. The courage to stop early. Stopping early is rarely rewarded culturally. It often looks like overreaction or pessimism. Yet early stopping is precisely what prevents later catastrophe. A system capable of early refusal demonstrates foresight. It values future coherence over present convenience. It understands that the cost of stopping rises sharply with delay. Early stopping is not caution. It is intelligence applied at the right scale. Meaning as a maintained property. Meaning does not persist automatically. It must be maintained. Maintenance requires boundaries. Boundaries require refusal. Refusal requires authority, structure, and practice. This is the central claim of this work. Meaning is not preserved by intention alone, but by disciplined interruption. The world that needs stopping. Modern systems are optimized relentlessly for speed, scale, and continuity. Stopping is treated as failure, inefficiency, or loss. Yet the failures that most damage trust, unsafe products, broken institutions, exhausted people, incoherent policies, are almost always failures of refusal. Motion continued long after preservation had failed. The discipline of stopping is therefore not optional. It is foundational. A final assertion. A system that can and will refuse to continue is a system worthy of trust. Its stillness is not emptiness. Its refusal is not defiance. Its halt is not collapse. It is care made visible. That is the discipline of meaning.